my immense pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Joanna Bourke, OBE. Joanna is Professor, she's very embarrassed about that part, Professor Emerita of History at Birkbeck, University of London, UK, and a Fellow of the British Academy. She has many books, not just the one she's going to be talking about today, but we're going to be focusing today on 5 evil women. We're going to be looking at Hindley, West, Wuornos, Homolka, and Tucker. But she's also written a book on disgrace, global reflections on sexual violence. And today, Joanna is going to be looking at these evil women, looking at a sort of critical comparative history of these reviled individuals. We're going to be looking at and examining their lives, crimes, and the cultural reception in the UK, US, and Canada. And Joanna is going to be discussing how violence committed by women is understood, judged, and remembered. We're going to be joining her in discovering what and how we understand notions of evil and how this is shaped by history, our belief systems, and ultimately, again, social context. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Joanna, and we are looking forward to hearing everything you have to share with us. So I'm going to hand over to you now.
Great. Thanks. I always get nervous at these introductions because you've basically heard the best of it. Now it's all going downhill from now. Look, I'm really thrilled that people that you came today. Yes, there we go. Really pleased you came today, especially since it's such a rotten day out. But I am particularly thrilled to be at this festival because I came to this festival a few years ago and I just had such a great time. So I hope you're also having a good time here. So today, as you've already heard, I'm going to be speaking about 5 evil women, the most reviled women in the modern Anglophone world. Myra Hindley, Rosemary West, Aileen Wuornos, Karla, Homolka, and Karla Faye Tucker. Their crimes of torture, of sexual abuse and murder attracted international notoriety, not only at the time they committed their crimes, but for decades afterwards. And this is why I've chosen these 5 women. In fact, the book originally had over 20 evil women. So we're in for some heavy stuff. Are you ready? Nothing gruesome, nothing very explicit. So I'm going to start in a light-hearted fashion. Before, of course, diving in deep into what we mean when we say someone is evil. I grew up with a certain ditty, Henry Longfellow's Jemima, that was constantly recited to me when I was a child. And people my age or older will definitely know this ditty. It's very popular at the time. It goes, there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. Like many women of my generation, I grew up with that poem, assimilating the notion that little girls were supposed to be cute and we're supposed to be virtuous, but we harbored this potential for true evil. Longfellow, incidentally, penned these lines for his daughter, who hated having her hair curled. A trivial protest, I think we will agree, but one that branded her as horrid. The ditty has become so iconic that most people, and certainly myself, don't know the rest of the lines. They go like this. She stood on her head on her little trundle bed, with nobody by for to hinder. She screamed and she squalled, she yelled and she bawled, and drummed her little heels against the window. Her mother heard the noise and thought it was the boys playing in the empty attic. She rushed upstairs, caught her unawares, and spanked her most emphatic. Now, in these lines, of course, the little girl is noisy. She's defiant. She is masculine. She's like the boys. She must be punished most emphatic. Now, this light-hearted poem contains many of the relevant themes for my reflections today on evil women. The poem hints at the anxiety caused by women who fail to act according to gender stereotypes. My book examines 5 of these women in detail and attempts to show that Evil is a cultural phenomenon. It changes in nature over time. It tells us a lot about concepts of evilness and femininity. Evil women, if you like, representing the extreme of deviance. They are doubly damned. First, for breaking the most fundamental social tenet of thou shalt not kill, let alone torture. And second, for, of course, deviating from highly esteemed feminine norms. In the book, I argue that that label that we place on these women, that label evil, is used when there is actually a lack of frames of meaning. In other words, we are literally shocked with horror. In today's talk, I'm actually only going to look at 3 of these women. I've only got 40 minutes, okay? You can read the others in the book. Hindley, West, Homolka. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the medical understandings of women who commit acts of extreme violence. And of course, the book looks at other discourses as well. Most importantly, it looks at theological, philosophical, sociological ones, and tabloid discourses around these women. But I'm trying to focus a little bit today. I'm going to start with Myra Hindley. Now, she's the one that I know everyone in this room will have heard about. She is the most well-known British evil women that I look at. By the way, the most well-known in Britain. What I found really fascinating, I look at two British women, 2 American women, 1 Canadian, how nation-state bound evil, definitions of evil are. Okay, very, very quickly, between 1963 and 1975, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who lived together, working class area of Manchester, tortured and murdered 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, 12-year-old John Kilbride, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, 16-year-old Pauline Reed, and 17-year-old Edward Evans. They were tried in 1966, and since only a few months prior to their trial, the capital punishment in Britain had been abolished. They couldn't be executed, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Hindley was to remain in prison for 36 years until she died 2002. Now, compared with the other women I'm going to be talking about, there was only one medical narrative around Hindley at the time, and that is that of degeneration. Crucially, the stigmata of degeneration was believed to be literally etched on the criminal's body. As with news reportage, psychiatric attention at the time focused on the most famous police mugshot here. In other words, the idea was that monstrosity could actually literally be seen simply by looking, and in ways that were not only gendered, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, but also highly classed and highly racialized. Now, it'll come to no surprise to some of you here that medical professionals turn to the most eminent, yet hugely controversial, theorist to make a link between the physical body and the interior, the evil within her. And this, of course, was the criminal anthropologist and Lombroso. In 1893, him and his assistant published La Donne Delinquente. It was translated into English just 2 years later, and over a quarter of its massive text, it's like this, massive text, was dedicated to proving that criminal women possess the stigmata of degeneration. And it was actually Lombroso and his assistant who coined that term, double deviance, even though some feminist authors say it's them. It's not, 1893. In their words, the born female criminal is doubly exceptional, first as a woman, then as a criminal. This is what makes her a true monster, and considerably more cruel than her male counterparts. Crucially, for Lombroso, degeneration of evil women was plain for everyone to see. According to them, and you may want to check out the person next to you, the faces of monstrous women were deeply lined and twisted, giving them the appearance of a satanic leer, like witches. Their hairs were darker than that of an honest woman. In other words, a nod to the racialized sciences. It was much more profuse in quantity, read animalistic, and was often prematurely grey on account of their agitated life. In other words, the fear of old crones or postmenopausal women. They described the criminal woman as typically short, overweight, more likely to have, don't look at me when I'm reading this, asymmetrical skulls, receding foreheads, jutting brows, enormous lower jaws, anomalous ears, I'm covering mine, and crooked noses. In other words, they were degenerates. Lombroso conceded that a ray of beauty could be detected in some of these women, but even in these cases, the women's appearance was more virile, masculine, more virile than feminine, which was repulsive. They were atavistic throwbacks to primitive life forms. They're not real women, they're masculine qualities. The most difficult, the most dangerous qualities that they possessed were, no surprise here, sexual, or what they called exaggerated eroticism. This sexual perversion often included a taste for lesbianism, they argued. Finally, like animals, primitives, and children, they lacked a moral sense. So what they basically believed is that normal women, even normal women, were less sensitive to pain than men. Okay, so normal, that's because we give birth. Normal women are less sensitive to pain. And, quote, because compassion is an effect of sensitivity, if one is lacking, the other will be too. In normal women, they believed, this defect was neutralized by their piety, maternity, sexual coldness, physical weakness, and intelligence, and undeveloped intelligence. So in normal women, it's neutralized: piety, maternity, sexual coldness, physical weakness, undeveloped intelligence. In female-born criminals, however, a morbid activity of the psychical centers intensifies their bad qualities, compelling these women to seek relief in evil deeds. They were all the more dangerous when piety and maternal feelings were replaced by cold passions and intense eroticism, muscular strength, and, most dangerous of all in a woman, superior intelligence. A bad thing. When this happens, the innocuous semi-criminal who is always present in the normal woman is transformed into a born criminal, more terrible than any male counterpart. Now, Lombroso's work was actually published 6 decades before Hindley's trial. But it was drawn upon time and again by commentators during and immediately after the trial, keen to draw a link between Hindley's appearance and degeneration. In addition to noting that she bore all the classic facial stigmata of degeneracy, they noted that she also spurned motherhood, was sexually voracious, and had hints of lesbianism. It was only in the mid-1980s, so 60s we're talking about, it's only 20 years later in the 80s that this language shifted from the language of stigmata of degeneracy, a la Lombroso, to stigmata of depravity, which in the post-1980s psychiatric labeling meant pedophilia and sadism. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. It's playing up there, isn't it? Okay. In contrast, let's just move on. In contrast, much of the loathing directed towards Hindley at the time, 60s, was paradoxically based on this deep-seated fear that, in fact, she was psychiatrically normal. This is certainly not the case with Brady. Okay? His actions were actually really easy to place within the usual frames of meaning. associated with violent men. He tortured animals as a child. He was in Borstal. He was very violent towards his schoolmates. He had a whole long history of criminal violence, and he was mentally unstable. And later in his life, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and acute paranoia. As people as different as David Smith, Hindley's brother-in-law, and witness to the murder of Edward Evans, and the mother of Leslie Ann Downey Buddett on 2 separate occasions, she is the worst. At least Brady had the decency to go mental. In contrast, Hindley was not suffering from a recognizable psychiatric illness. There were also no claims at the time of paedophilia. At the time of her trial, the media-inspired panics over women's involvement in child sexual abuse was not part of popular consciousness. That wasn't going to happen until the 1980s, basically. The shift from degeneration to psychiatric depravity was most starkly revealed during the controversy around the Sensation exhibition, Royal Academy of Arts, 1997, where Marcus Harvey's massive painting entitled Myra generated for the first time, so this is 1997 here, for the first time, links between her and paedophilia. By the way, of those who don't know this famous painting, it was created using casts from 2 child's hands, and I talk a lot about the painting. It's also massive. The same self-image that had been used to reveal Hindley's degeneration, in other words, the police mugshot, was now the image revealing her paedophilic identity. Now, Hindley's treatment by psychiatrists in the late 1960s to the 1990s was in stark contrast to the treatment of Rose West. When the crimes that she committed and her husband, Frederick West, came to light in the 1990s. Very briefly again, between 1971 and 1987, Fred and Rose West sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed an unknown number of girls and women. Fred West committed suicide in prison, and in November 1995, Rose West was found guilty of killing 10 girls and women. They were stepdaughter Charmaine West, Linda Goff, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Sengel-Law, Shirley Herbert, Uetta Malt, Shirley Robinson, Alison Chambers, and Rose West's own daughter, Heather West. There were definitely other victims, many of whom, in fact, survived the torture, but others, of course, did not. She was sentenced to prison for life, and incidentally, she is still alive. She hasn't given an interview for like 26 years. I wasn't able to interview her. Okay, so how, in contrast to Myra Hindley, how did medical professionals explain Rose West's viciousness? Now, her crimes were committed 3 decades before those of Myra Hindley. 3 decades. But what is remarkable, I think, is that they elicited similar sociological anxieties. These were around the effects of pornography, violence in the mass media, the permissive society, and the disruption of traditional gender roles. But the medical commentary was very, very different. Rose West's early childhood and entire life had been one of abuse. Early on, it was very obvious that she had severe learning difficulties. There was speculation that this might have been due to the fact that her mother received ECT, when she was pregnant. Fellow students used to bully her as Dozy Rosie. Her father, William Letts, was mentally ill. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as a young man. He ruled over his family with a rod of steel and was prone to extreme violence within the family. He was also a sexual sadist. He raped Rose West throughout her childhood. As a child, she was also raped twice by strangers, a secret she kept to herself. At the age of 14, she was selling sex. When Rose encountered Fred West, who, by the way, was also known as Weird Freddie, she believed that she had met, in her words, the prince who would take her away from her family. She had turned 15 the day before they met. He was 27. Like Rose, Fred had also been raised in a highly abusive, sex-obsessed home. From the age of 12, he was having sex with his mother and was probably being sexually abused by his father, who introduced him to bestiality. When Rose fell in love with him, she was unaware that he was already a rapist and had committed at least 2 murders. Now, psychiatrists, not a happy life. Psychiatrists and psychologists in the 1990s immediately latched on to the fact that surviving such a painful childhood and youth was fertile grounds for developing attachment disorders. The theoretical framework for attachment disorders is, of course, John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. According to Bowlby, interpersonal relationships in childhood enable infants to develop knowledge about themselves and about others. If denied love, infants become enraged and or withdrawn. That affects their life throughout their life, affects their relationships throughout their life. The implication, of course, is that the abusive early life experiences, which there's no question Rose West suffered, causes infants to develop insecure attachments and personality disorders, both of which are risk factors for future maladaptation and aggression. So, but of course, it's really important to note that the attachment disorder label does not generate sympathy for women who act violently. It doesn't even act as a kind of mitigating circumstance. West's early childhood experiences actually in the trial served to make her more dangerous. Her history was even linked to a narrative of criminality that was predetermined. In other words, she'd inherited this as well from her violent father. Okay. Psychiatrists and psychologists trotted out the usual arguments about degeneration. We heard about all of those with Myra Hindley. She was dead-eyed. Her face was the color of yesterday's porridge. She was some kind of Neanderthal mutant, savage throwback to an earlier age. So these are familiar from Myra Hindley, but there were 2 new themes. The clinical, as opposed to psychological, sociological pathologies of sexual sadism and pedophilia came really to the fore. Although Hindley had also been present when at least one of her victims was tortured, there was no suggestion at the time that Hindley engaged in those acts for her own personal gratification. This was not the case by the time we get to Rose West. When West was committing her offenses, the concept of sexual sadism was already a century old. And there's an important exception. The exception is female Nazi guards. Except for that, though female Nazi guards, it was not applied. This was not applied to women. The author of this, of course, is Richard von Krafft-Ebing in his famous book, Psychopathia Sexualis, where he argued that sadism was an excess of normal male sexuality. As he put it, sadism is nothing more than an excessive and monstrous pathological intensification of phenomena which accompany the psychical vita sexualis, particularly in men. I think he needs AI to prove that sentence. Anyway, for Krafft-Ebing, physiological conditions explained why monstrous sadistic acts are more common in men than in women. He explained, In the intercourse of the sexes, the active or aggressive role belongs to man. Woman remains passive, defensive. It affords a man great pleasure to win a woman, to conquer her. Under normal circumstances, a man meets obstacles, which it is his part to overcome, and for which nature has given him an aggressive character. This aggressive character, however, under pathological conditions, may likewise be excessively developed and express itself in an impulse to seduce, absolutely the object of his desire, even to destroy or kill it. In sadistical sexual act, in other words, this normal, heteromasculine cauldron of passion overheats and explodes, sometimes causing real injury, wound, or death. Now, Craft Openings devoted only 2 pages to female sadists compared to over 50 to male ones. But these pages were pored over by medical professionals trying to understand Rose West's violence, believing that female sexuality was passive and masochistic. Female sadists were psychiatric anomalies. They were truly monstrous. Now, the second major difference between psychiatric commentary on West compared with Hindley until the 1990s was the appeal to paedophilia. As with all the paraphilias, which is the general term for sexual disorders, as with all the paraphilias, except, no surprise here, masochism, which was a female affliction, all the others were largely assumed just to be male pathologies. As therapist Jane Mathis put it in his book, Clear Thinking About Sexual Deviations, it was unthinkable that a woman might seduce a helpless child. He added, and even if she did so, what harm could be done without a penis? It was only from the late 1980s that the maleness of paedophilias began to be questioned. And the important thing here is 1986, where David Finkelhall published research revealing that 1/5 of sexually abused boys named a woman as their abuser. Convinced by such research, the British charity Kidscape hosted a national conference on female offenders 2 years later, and it steamrolled, became a big issue. Turning now to the third woman, and I'm going to draw them all together at the end. Third woman of this I'm talking about today, Karla Homolka. We need, of course, to return to attachment disorders, albeit with a sadism twist. Now, many of you may not know Homolka. Her name, though, is a byword for evil in Canada. Born 4th of May 1917, she was white, heterosexual, conventionally beautiful young woman who enthusiastically participated in the sadistic killing of 3 girls and young women between 1990 and 1992. These were Tammy Homolka, her sister, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. She did so alongside her husband, Paul Bernardo. And again, same story. For psychiatrists, Bernardo's easy. For everyone, in fact, Bernardo was easy to understand, to explain. He was a conventional sexual sadist in the usual medical way. But clinical experts, legal authorities, media commentators struggled to fit Homolka into their explanatory frames. The problem was that she was just the typical Canadian young woman. She was raised in a secure middle-class home in Ontario. Her blonde attractiveness did not mask any atavistic or degenerative instincts, unlike Myra Hindley. There was no difficult childhood to excavate or attachment disorders, as with Rose West. Lesbianism out of the frame. She loved animals, had a high IQ. How could she have participated in these acts? Now, initially, the answer that was generally accepted by medical professionals as well as the court and the media was that she was suffering from battered women syndrome. The ideas behind this diagnosis were propagated by psychologist Leonore E. Walker, there we go, in a number of really influential texts, including this one. Walker drew on studies based on dogs, showing how learnt helplessness developed and could result in bizarre actions. So the research she's referring to, the dog research, is that of Martin Seligman. His experiments were definitely unethical today, but they were considered unethical at the time he was doing them. He gave caged dogs electric shocks at random times and at varied intervals. Once the dogs learned that they couldn't escape, they stopped responding to the pain, and they became compliant, passive, submissive. In fact, they didn't even try to escape when he left the doors open for the cages. Walker takes this idea and applies it to women. Says, this is what happens to a battered woman. In her words, repeated batterings, like electric shocks, diminish the woman's motivation to respond. She becomes passive. She says, no matter what I do, I have no influence. So Walker's research is really important because it helped people explain, courts explain, it was accepted in courts, by the way, explain that why a minority of battered women killed their batterers, killed their abusers. The theory, of course, is much more complicated than the summary I've given here. Suffice to say that it's recognized in Canadian law and evoked time and again in Homolka's trial. And in fact, Homolka embraces it herself. The problem is obvious, was that, well, firstly, she made a plea deal with the courts. She gave testimony against her husband in exchange for only 12 years imprisonment. But then it was discovered, after the plea deal was made, tapes were discovered showing that she was an active participant. Okay, problems, obvious. Problem number one, this does not square with the she was coerced narrative. Second, battered women syndrome does not explain why a woman might attack other women as opposed to their abusers. For this, they had to introduce compliant victim of a sexual sadist theory. Okay, so this is the other theory that became really important for this trial. Terms coined by FBI agent Robert Roy Hazelwood, forensic psychiatrist Paul Dietz, and psychiatrist Janet Warren. They interviewed the female partners of male sexual sadists, and they called these women compliant victims. Okay, so they are led to commit these terrible crimes through being repeatedly given the equivalent of electric shocks. For Hazelwood, Warren, and Dietz, compliant victims were always female. Men were never described as compliant victims of sadistic female partners. All the compliant victims had been severely beaten, and they used behavioral modification arguments to make the links. And they also drew on, at the time, huge debates that were taking place at more or less the same time about brainwashing. And so they use brainwashing as well to explain how they could do this. In order to understand who invented this term, though that context is absolutely central. Compliant and brainwashed people, this sort of, if you think of the prisoners of war from Korea as an example, but also, as they're using it, the romantically starved women served as lightning rods for more widespread anxieties about the ability of women in particular from the mid-20th century onwards to assert their agency in the face of the mysterious and malign forces of neoliberalism, liberalism operating beneath the surface of society and almost impossible to detect. So this term was routinely used to explain Homolkas, but in the end they had to stick with the plea deal because otherwise no criminal would ever comply. So this notion of the compliant victim was especially pertinent in that it not only explained but also endorsed a phallocentric notion of female agency in which certain women were both victims of men and compliant with extreme violence. In this way, female agency, if you like, almost disappears completely from the story. Compliant women only exist in relation to male agency. And of course, those of you here thinking about Myra Hindley, this is the diametrically opposite argument to the one of Myra Hindley, who was given hyper agency. In fact, she was the one, they said, who forced or encouraged Ian Brady to commit these crimes. It's instructive to ask then, so what actually has changed between the 1960s, when Hindley committed her crimes, and the 1990s, where Homolka committed hers? So what was it that made this period of history increasingly conducive to exchanging hyper agency, women with hyper agency, to women with no agency or very little agency at all? So I think part of this shift is due to the rise of female-orientated and often feminist-led psychology. In the 1960s, female psychologists were extremely rare, and most of them were not aligned with any of the feminism of their time. From the 1980s, however, feminist psychologists were making significant strides in their professions, and their research on the devastating impact of domestic violence on women's lives, as well as on the gendered biases of law, were becoming increasingly compelling. So the feminist psychologists, together with feminist lawyers and activists, were effective, if you like, in drawing attention to widespread male violence, especially within domestic spheres. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, these powerful feminist critiques were absolutely crucial. But there were also wider societal changes that I think help explain what's happening. After all, in the 1960s, feminists did not come to the defense of Hindley. Rather, they were silently appalled that any woman could have acted as Hindley had done. Indeed, the main commentary on Hindley was explicitly anti-feminist, blaming female permissiveness and the loosening of constraints on women in society. By the 1990s, however, the crisis of the family, falling birth rates, neoliberal mantras about equality between the sexes had made non-feminist commentators aware of the need to realign, societal values. Now, although many of these commentators did believe that the radical feminists had gone too far in their critique, exaggerating the oppression of women and so on, even the non-feminist, conservative commentators accepted that still too many husbands and fathers are acting badly towards their womenfolk. However, the solution that they devised was not tackling masculinity, but rather insisting on a return to family values, which was code for reinstating female dependency on men. On kinder men, together with a partial acceptance in certain legal, not all, legal jurisdictions of feminist expert witnesses who presented accounts of the impact of violence on women's lives, the idea of limited female agency seemed increasingly convincing. On the neoliberal, neoconservative right, there was something convenient about the idea that powerful husbands and fathers could guide their weaker and more traditional, more irrational female partners and relatives. At the very least, it incited this kind of paternalistic sentiment that could be harnessed for the greater good of the nation, as well as the family. And Homolka provides us, I think, with an illustration of the fact that in seeking to explain their actions, it's actually not necessary to defeminize women, as they did with Myra Hindley and Rose West, because femininity itself could be seen as monstrous, especially when understood through the lens of romantic narratives and love forever after. Finally, let's return to Tennyson's "When she was bad, she was horrid." It became a dominant mantra from the 1990s, repeated by dozens of books. In fact, nearly every book, I promise you, that I read on these evil women repeat that when she was bad, she was horrid. We may want to ask, well, okay, what is at stake in insisting that women are as bad as men? The slogan, "Women do it too," or that women are just as bad as men, has generated enormous number of panics, stirred up primarily, but not wholly, by neoconservative feminists. It's based on 4 misconceptions. These are: women are as violent as men. They aren't. 2, the predominance of male violence against women has been exaggerated. Well, it has not. 3, all violence, physical, psychological, basically the same. Not true. And 4th, that feminism bears a responsibility for the emergence of exceptionally violent women. It does not. The mantra, "women do it too," in other words, insists on a common inhumanity that transcends gender. Politically, it's part of a carceral term, and by carceral I mean a lock 'em up and throw away the key. So this carceral return, particularly from the 1990s, within certain neoliberal and neoconservative feminist movements. To conclude, very quickly, 30 seconds. We will never know why women like these, like this 5 in the book, acted the way they did. They don't know why they acted the way they did. Their voices are often silenced, or they're heard from through the lens of male institutions, such as courtrooms, mass media, true crime reporting, psychiatric theories. Often the psychiatrists and medical professionals who talked to them, who wrote about them, never even talked to them, these evil women themselves. What is available, though, allows us to explore changes in the ways their crimes have been interpreted. They tell us, I think, a great deal about social anxieties and notions of gender, particularly femininity. And they also, I think, point to the increased medicalization of female violence. But also, crucial in this, they require us to pay attention not only to gender, as I have done today, but also to class and racialization. My book argues that evil is too important to be left to theologians, tabloid journalists, and carceral feminists. It seeks to show how historical analysis of the way evil is understood in different contexts and how that changes over time, I think helps us to think again about developing a feminist ethics of care that is not beholden to either medicalized or carceral approaches. And the last chapter in my book actually tries to suggest a way forward in dealing with exceptionally violent women. Thanks.
Thank you. Forgive me, no watch, so I keep checking my phone to keep an eye on the time. We have got time for a few questions. Please wait as the lollipop mic will come to you. Would anybody like to kick us off? Anybody got a question for Joanna?
Oh, did I put everyone to sleep?
There we go, got a brave hand straight away. Thank you.
Forgive my ignorance, but all these women were in relationships with men. Are there evil women that are not in relationships with men in the same sort of category?
Thank you for asking that. Yes, one of my 4 women, Aileen Wuornos, the American who killed 7 men when she was working as an exit-to-exit sex worker on Florida's highways. She was in a relationship with a woman. Who here knows the film Monster? Monster is based on her. Okay, so she is an example. And she fits a lot of what we've been talking about here, just terrible, terrible childhood and everything like that. Now, here I'm going to come to my polemic. At the time, huge emphasis was placed on her lesbianism. And she actually gained the support of a lot of feminist lesbian people in the States, who basically argued that the 7 men she brutally killed, dead, got their comeuppance. They'd all picked her up as a sex worker, and she claimed, and it's highly plausible, that they attempted to rape her or not pay and stuff like that, and that's why she killed them. Whether it's true or not, it's plausible because some of them have a long history of sexual violence, including prison violence. I have a problem with it because, in a sense, she did it because she was a lesbian, she was really a man. Well, we know that's just plain homophobic. But secondly, all her life she had relationships with men. She only had 2 relationships with women in her life. One was extremely short. The other one was Tyra, the woman she lived with for 4 years before she was arrested. And the whole movie Monster is based on the premise of she did it for love of her female lover. And I just think that's very problematic. But yes, all the other women did it with another man. And if you look at serial killers, Aileen Wuornos is said to be, again wrongly, the first female serial killer. It's not true, by the way, but that's what every book tells you. But if you look at serial killers, between 5 and 12% of all serial killers are women, and nearly all of them, very few exceptions, committed alongside a man. There are a few exceptions, but I'm making it up, but it's about 1 or 2%. It's tiny.
Thank you. Got another question after that.
How would you classify Ruth Ellis, who killed David Blakely? I happened to be unfortunate enough to have known Blakely, and he was an absolute shocker.
Yes. She doesn't fit into the category of evil, in my view. She killed for a very base reason, and that is, well, all of them killed for very base reasons, and that was sexual jealousy. And she killed one person in a frenzy. And she was labeled evil at the time, but then completely drops out of that evil narrative. One of the things I spent a lot of time with when I started to work on this book was what is the criteria for being talked about in the book, to be called an evil woman in the context of my book. And the criteria was that they were not only labeled evil at the time, which nearly every woman, or indeed most violent people are labeled at the time they commit their crimes, but for decades afterwards. And in a sense, she's very easy to understand, Alice, because you could understand it was a woman scorned. The thing about evil is that label is placed on someone when you can't find a narrative, a societally accepted or whatever narrative. And that's when that label evil is applied for long periods.
Thank you. Got another right at the back.
You're getting exercise today.
I don't know, maybe more of an observation than a question. Do you think people struggle with a lack of remorse or attrition when a woman commits a crime? than, say, a man, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, remorse is a really big thing. Firstly, with the exception of Rose West, all of the women I deal with, and indeed the whole 20 in the broader scheme of my brain, expressed extreme remorse for what they did. It didn't wash with anyone, and this is another interesting thing about that evil label, because if they cried, which they did, it was crocodile tears. If they were stoical, which Myra Hindley tried to do, then they were just cold bitchs. Okay, so they couldn't win either way. And all the evidence of remorse is simply literally dismissed for one of those two reasons. And that's what makes them particularly powerful in sort of circulating narratives within our society, because they can't, if you, in a sense, to be truly evil, you can't have remorse. This also, just as a little footnote here, is one of the reasons why Rose West was the most difficult woman for me, because Rose West never expressed remorse, not to this day. So yeah. And if we're talking about agency, Rose West definitely wasn't very, very active in what they did. Whereas in the other cases, all the women had agency, they knew what they were doing, they knew that what they were doing was very, very wrong, but they still did it. They still had agency. But Rose West was very, very proactive in the forms of abuse and torture.
Oh, great question. So far, hand at the back there.
Thank you. I guess more of like a kind of process question. I assume you didn't speak to any of these women like yourself, but like how close did you get to any of them? Did you speak to people who did know them well, did meet them in a kind of clinical capacity or any other, I guess?
Yeah, I spoke to a lot of people who met them in clinical capacity, but no other capacity. In a sense, that was a conscious decision on my part, because firstly, I didn't talk to them because they don't know why they did what they did. And if you look, and they change their stories depending on the different narratives that, if you like, are circulating within society. They pick this one here. Homolka really liked battered women's syndrome. So they pick up different things at different times, and what they pick up changes depending on what the current explanations that are given within society. And this is one of the really useful things, I think, about using history as a lens, because we can see how it changes, and it changes for various broad sociological, economic, etc. reasons. So, yeah, the source base is massive. There's been just so much written about these women. Firstly, of course, in the archives, going through the trial transcripts and things like that. Every newspaper reported on all of these women. There have been numerous true crime, my great hated genre, hundreds of true crime stuff been written about them, literally hundreds, no exaggeration. And, very interesting, people talk about them using their first names. They become very intimate. So I'm not really interested in why they did it or why they think they did it. I'm more interested in what language they are using to try and explain, and different actors within society are using to try and explain what they did.
Now, I'm aware of the time, and I'm very strict instructions. We have to finish on time. So I'm going to close the questions there, but I do want to alert you that Joanna I'm going to be guiding her downstairs, where you can come and meet her. You can have a look at her book. You can buy her book. She will sign the book for you if you want. But do take up this opportunity. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Joanna, for a fascinating sort of conversation with us. I have to say, I have read the book. Double thumbs up from me. It's excellent. I can highly recommend. So thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I hope it's given you some food for thought. Thank you.